Thank you, Chancellor. Here to interview the Vice-Chancellor this evening is a man with whom many of us are familiar, especially from his work on ABC television. Richard Morecroft is perhaps best known for his 2 decades as a 7 p.m. news presenter for ABC television, and more recently as the host of Letters and Numbers on SBS. Richard has worked extensively as a Master of Ceremonies, panel and forum facilitator, and media skills executive trainer. Some of us here at Macquarie have been privileged to have Richard as our trainer in polishing up our media skills. Thank you, Richard. Professor Bruce Dowton officially took up the role as Vice-Chancellor at the beginning of September. Bruce brings a stellar international reputation with him. His most recent post was as clinical professor in paediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Until recently, he was Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Partners Harvard Medical International. He is also an Emeritus Professor at the University of New South Wales, where he was Dean of the School of Medicine between 1998 and 2005. And tonight we're going to find out more about him. Please welcome Dr. Morecroft and Professor Bruce Dowton.
Please have a seat.
Thank you.
Well, I must say thank you very much indeed to Professor Sachs, and I must also say that it is a great honour to be invited here this evening to share a conversation with the Vice-Chancellor, and also to be part of the celebrations of this wonderful venue revealing its refurbished form, and it was wonderful to hear from the Chancellor about some of that history of refurbishment. We have already heard Professor Sachs just mention a couple of the achievements in Professor Dowton's history, but let me just briefly refer to a few more elements in the Vice-Chancellor's background before we actually move on to our discussion. Now, as many of you would know, of course, Professor Dowton has served as a senior medical executive with a range of positions in university, in healthcare, and in consulting organisations. But from the little town of Ivanhoe in the far west of New South Wales, where he was born, Professor Dowton was the first of his family to go to university through the determined support of his parents. And his academic success, specifically, I guess, in medical fields, involved him in projects around the world that the young Bruce Dowton, growing up as a child in Dubbo, really could hardly have dreamed of. He's developed medical schools and university governance in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kazakhstan. He's organised a national chronic disease strategy in North Africa. He's reviewed a national health system in the Caribbean. And these are just some of the projects that came along with the role of Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Harvard Medical International and Partners Harvard Medical International. For over a decade, from the mid-1980s, he held several positions at Washington University's School of Medicine in St. Louis, notably as Director of the Division of Medical Genetics at St. Louis Children's Hospital, and as Associate Dean and Associate Vice-Chancellor at Washington University. He led many developments in educational programs for medical students and graduates. He also served as a paediatrician at the Massachusetts General Hospital for Children, as well as clinical professor of paediatrics at Harvard Medical School. As we heard, back here in Australia, he was Dean of the University of New South Wales Medical School in Sydney. And at the invitation of the New South Wales State Health Minister, Professor Dowton established and chaired the Medical Education and Training Council, which has evolved to become the Clinical Education and Training Institute, completely reorganising the oversight of postgraduate clinical education programs across some 60 hospitals. He holds medical degrees and a research doctorate in cell biology from the University of Sydney, and is trained as a clinical geneticist. But what does he do in his spare time, you may ask? And you never know, we may find that out very shortly. But first, welcome, Professor Dowton. It's a delight to be able to have this chat. There are many, many more professional achievements I could have mentioned, but casting your mind back to that young schoolboy that you were in Dubbo, how do you think he might react to that list that we've just heard if he knew that that was going to be his life to this point?
Well, as I do cast my mind back, I think I would feel a sense of extraordinary privilege, Richard, in having had the opportunity to study initially, and more importantly perhaps, the opportunity to intersect with some wonderful individuals throughout my professional life who helped me see pathways that were perhaps unusual, who helped me craft a career that is a little eclectic, off the beaten track, not following the traditional pathways. And I do sit here now with both an extraordinary sense of humility, being invited to serve this university at this time in its history, as well as a sense of great privilege at the enormous opportunities that were afforded to me, largely through the support of family and mentors and institutions that I feel very attached to throughout the world.
But going back to that little child, you know, he wouldn't have conceived of all of this, but give us a sense of what that little child was like. Were you, as some children are, very determined, very ambitious, very clear about your studies and other things, or, you know, were you a little bit easy come, easy go as a youngster?
If I were to try to recreate my days learning French during high school, I would perhaps say I was a sportif. I was not a sportsman. My older brother was a good sportsman. I was not a good sportsman. I was struck with a sense of determination, I think, about inquiry, about learning about the world, and early appetite for medicine, which went deeply into my roots back actually before Dubbo in history, and a sense of reaching out at every opportunity to learn something about a field that I felt attracted to, or in some ways, as I believe, in some senses, the privilege of being a physician is a calling, and I felt that sense of calling quite early on.
We might go back to childhood and some of those very important family influences a little bit later, but I think perhaps to start with we should look at some very broad questions and that sense of taking up the challenge here at Macquarie University, as we've heard. It's only a couple of months or so since you took up the position. How different does this feel to previous positions, which have had very strong medical focuses?
Well, it feels in some ways very different and in some ways very familiar. It feels quite different in the sense that I'm focused now on one institution and where it fits into the firmament of Australian higher education and I believe regional and global higher education in aspirational sense. I also feel a sense of familiarity in terms of one of the things in doing the sorts of positions I've held over the last few years, and indeed practicing clinical medicine in the discipline of genetics, was one about complexity. So, and complexity is both something which I am attracted towards. Boredom for me is a huge problem. I like to be working in complex dynamics, and so the professional opportunities I've had, including from very early days as a young physician in the growing field of human genetics as it was being born, was very much about complexity. And this environment here, thank you very much, is a very complex environment.
I was just going to say, I doubt that boredom would be one of the major problems you face on a day-to-day basis.
I have not had an opportunity for boredom yet, and again, thank you all, I appreciate the opportunity.
But how do you get across? I mean, you're speaking of complexity. You come into a huge organisation like this. How much of a challenge is that complexity of issues and that organisational web that you have to deal with very quickly?
Well, I think part of it is trying to wrap one's mind around the context in which the university finds itself in Australia right now. I've clearly been out of Australia for 7 or so years, so relearning where the higher education sector is up to in Australia is something which has been a fast-paced part of the inauguration into the role. But also I feel a sense of strong welcome on the part of colleagues across the university who have already given of themselves, their time, their wisdom, their insight to help me get rapidly through the landscape of doing a mid-level review of the landscape that we find ourselves in internally with its complexities and the landscape we find ourselves in regionally and nationally and beyond. And the colleagues I have already proven to be extraordinarily generous with their affording me of time, insight, wisdom, and occasional advice.
A good combination. We'll perhaps come back to some of those challenges to the education sector and the tertiary education sector in particular very shortly, but I want to go back to some of those previous range of activities that you've been involved with. And how much have those previous responsibilities shaped you and changed you?
Well, I think they've enormously shaped who I am today. They have afforded me the opportunity to work in a diverse array of professional activities as a clinician, as a researcher in molecular biology, as an educator, as an administrator, as a leader, as a consultant. And all of those things have different attributes of professional life. So, at a high-level sense, they have really shaped who I am. But the thing which has probably more importantly shaped me, as I alluded to earlier, is the intersection with wonderful people across those experiences who have delivered to me insights and perspectives about cultures, about disciplines about which I know little, which is an enormously attractive part of this role, to understand disciplines that I've never dealt with in detail. But the people interface, the human interface, has been a hugely important part of, I think, allowing me to come to a point of an odd combination of excitement, nervous energy on some fronts, but also comfort in coming into a role like this, that this is a professional series of roles that have very much prepared me to take on and lead this institution to its next stage of development.
You mentioned that human interaction, and mentors are a very important part of life that I know you've respected greatly in the past. But can you give me a sense of whether there have been particular turning points or particular interactions with individuals where there has been almost a revelatory or a really changing moment?
Yes. Probably the one that I could point to is the decision as a young doctor in my first year after graduation from Sydney University Medical School, having spent some time in Boston as a final year medical student on an elective rotation, and enormously excited about the opportunity to be in the Harvard Medical School environment, and made the commitment to myself that one day I would go back there to work. And I was determined to make that happen. The trajectory of medical training in Australia under a group of organisations that are the Royal Colleges has a fairly set trajectory where one must go through the steps of a certain number of years and then perhaps spend a little time offshore before returning to Australia. Well, I wanted to fast track this. I was hungry to move my life along, to get back into an environment in Boston where the streets around the Harvard Medical Complex are named after many of the great physicians who discovered diseases. A lot of discovery was happening. Genetics was being born as a research discipline in a molecular sense in Boston and other cities in the United States. And so I applied for entry into the residency training program at the Boston Children's Hospital. And with the exception of 2 men, I was told if I did that, I was ruining my career. I would never be welcome to come back and work in Australia. This was not the done thing. I had to go through the traditional approach to collegiate trainings with the Royal College system in Australia, and if I wanted to, I could go offshore. Two men, both of whom are still wonderful mentors and friends to me. One 99 years old and still very active, and one in his early 80s. Both were professors at the university, one recently in retirement, and I was his last intern during my 1 year after my medical school time. Both said to me, go. You need to go and pursue your dreams. You need to not listen to the conventional wisdom that's being told to you. Things will work out. And those men had mentored me as a medical student and encouraged me, shaped my thinking. One of them helped me get a research grant to go and chase an Italian family on an island with a rare genetic disease as a medical student off the northern Sicilian coast. They said, don't listen to the conventional wisdom, go pursue your dream. And I did. And for some reason, I did come back to Australia, not once, but twice. So thank you to the Chancellor and the Council.
And did you ever regret that act of defiance?
The only moment of anxiety I had about that decision at all was when I fell foul of the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service and ran out of employment authorization and was served a deportation order.
That would have been an awkward moment.
That was a moment of intense focus, particularly when my wonderful parents, who had never travelled outside Australia, were due to arrive on their first visit to the United States in the time that I was being served a deportation order.
A rather unfortunate juxtaposition, but I'm sure it resolved well.
I was not deported, please.
One of the aspects of the genetic work that you did, as I understand it, and you were a paediatrician as well, was that it was a difficult area of work sometimes, because for the families whose children had some of the diseases that you had to work with, there was often some very bad news. How did that shape you? And I suppose I'm particularly interested in how you related to those families and those parents to whom you had to give very bad news.
It was probably, as I cast my mind back over my professional life, it probably is the single profoundest influence on my professional life. The opportunity to share in the tragedy of families who have children with often devastating illnesses, and to not be able to deliver to them cure or treatment that would render the situation completely null, but to help and guide their decision making, to support them, to share with them whatever professional wisdom I had, and to share with them their pain and grief was a huge influence on my life. I still to this day connect with many of those families whose children did not survive, sometimes a matter of a few weeks, sometimes a matter of many years. And it was the thing which, as I've reflected on this, and I have deeply reflected on this, it is a moment in my life that is very protracted. So whenever now I face a circumstance in my professional life, and I can assure you there have been none here yet, where I have been particularly feeling down about my personal circumstance, it is simply a matter of me saying to myself, get an image in your mind of a family whose child you cared for, who you stood at the bedside, whom you walked the corridor with late at night, whom you spoke at the child's funeral. The hardest thing I've ever done. That helps me to reanchor myself around those situations define adversity. The particular moment I find myself in recently, and probably coming up along the way here somewhere, there will be moments of where I say to myself, what am I doing here? And I wish I wasn't here, and this is awful, and so on. It just takes me reflecting back deeply into those families to regather myself and say, you have no right to feel sorry for yourself. this is not the definition of adversity. Those children and those families define adversity much more powerful than anything I could possibly confront in a professional sense.
But in those situations where a child perhaps was going to die and you knew that they were, and this is quite a personal question, really, because how do you have the communication skills to speak at that personal level to those parents? And how are those kind of communication skills in any way relevant to the sort of organisational communication skills that really are your professional life now?
Well, I think one does gather the personal strength in a circumstance like that to recognise that there is a need for empathy and not sympathy. Sympathy is a sloppy emotion, in my view, that has no place in such professional context. The sense of being able to reach out to a family and, most importantly, to listen, to hear what their concerns are, to be able to interpolate their concerns into a framework of reacting to the news you have to give or have given, the pain they feel, the impending grief that they feel. And sometimes it is a matter of simply being honest. One of the hardest things that doctors trained in my generation and medical students trained today have to learn to do is say, I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question you're asking me, but I will try to find out. And if I can find out, I will share it with you honestly. If I can't find the answer, I will tell you I can't find the answer. And to put in a perspective, perhaps as I often did, saying to families that you will receive a lot of gratuitous advice. And as I mentioned before, I've had a little gratuitous advice since I arrived here, so I know something about gratuitous advice. I would often say to families, people will say to you, time will heal everything, to which the only response could be, that is nonsense. Time does not heal everything. Some way, human beings have a marvellous capacity to come to terms with adversity in their lives and put it in a context that they can deal with and bring it out increasingly less frequently, but still recognise and deal with the pain and the anguish they feel, particularly over the loss of a child. So how does that relate to the circumstance here? Well, I think what I learned out of that was a capacity to often stop and listen, to try to understand the reference frame that the questions or the statements were being made in that context through another person's lens, and to help interpret the complexity of what might be behind a vast array of medical information to a working class family, or a family where the parents couldn't read or write, or a family who came from a very wealthy family who were demanding and wanting to know every scare of information, making a judgment call about how to bring into the right reference frame the right degree of interpretation of complexity or information. And that translates very adequately, in my experience, to the role I have here now, about listening, about interpreting complexity, about being respectful of individuals and the community at large.
So, with that communication basis, what actually motivates you in this sort of role? You know, or whether you're organising something in Kazakhstan or you know, taking up this position in Macquarie, what is the core motivation on a personal level for you?
I think at a very fundamental level for me, it is the opportunity to work with other bright people, to work with other dedicated people, folks who have a sense of purpose, that we can all do better than we're doing now, that we can be receptive to the notion of shaping innovation, creativity together, that it is not the reality that the sum is simply the individual parts. The result should be more than the sum of the individual parts, and that requires bright minds to collaborate and build consensus. My job, I think, is to help shape the conversations, help interpret the environment, help urge the community that is Macquarie University, all the teams I've led in the past across diverse parts of the world, many cultures, many continents, to see solutions that might be sustainable over time and be better than where we are now.
Because where we are now is an extraordinarily challenging time for education and for tertiary institutions in particular. We look to the universities of the future, and we read, for example, in the recent Ernst & Young report, which I'm sure would have caused more than frissons of concern around the academic communities. In fact, can I quote a couple of things from the beginning of the Ernst & Young report, and they begin by saying, "Our research shows the dominant Australian university model, a broad-based teaching and research institution with a large base of assets and back office, will be unviable in the next 10 to 15 years. Public institutions will increasingly be run like corporations while seeking to maintain the freedom of inquiry and academic rigour that their long-term reputation depends on." That's a big challenge to a place like this and most other universities. How are you going to rise to that challenge?
Well, I think the first thing that I want to do is to have a planning process which will gather the university community, both external and internal, particularly internal, together in a fairly fast-paced way over probably the early parts of next year, starting very shortly, to challenge some of the assumptions that are in reports like the Ernst & Young report. I'm not particularly fussed about the Ernst & Young report. There have been iterations of that in the United States context by McKinsey a couple of years ago. People like Clayton Christensen and Henry Eyring have written about the same subjects a couple of years ago in a marvellous book comparing Harvard University with Brigham Young, Idaho. An excellent book I commend to my academic colleagues. So the themes are the same, but I think what we do is we challenge some of the assumptions, the truisms that we are stayed in the way we are. I think the truth there is contestable. I think that modern universities, and particularly what drew me to this university, was the reality that we can push the boundaries. We can stay true to some core principles, yet we can morph and evolve to meet the context of a rapidly changing world and to meet that in a way which is fundamentally what universities are about, which is discovering newness, discovering new information, new knowledge, and discovering new ways to do things. And that is, I think, an exciting challenge. And the reason I'm here today, not having been looking to relocate back to Australia and not having been necessarily looking to change roles, is that I think this university, in this country, at this time, is the best solution university to meet that challenge.
But how difficult is it for any university to keep a clear and a confident vision in the face of calls for essentially business-style templates?
Well, I think in that, inherently is a fundamental principle that I adhere to, is that we should not shy away from the complexity of what's at hand. It is extraordinarily complex, but we should not come up with overly simplistic solutions to the complex dynamics that are out there. We should grasp that and address it. And to be sure, universities are, even today, very large business, in quotation mark, enterprises. But the fundamental reality is that what sets a university apart from a business is that our very purpose of existing, about the teaching and learning enterprise and the discovery of new knowledge, is something that we must grasp and stay firm to and anchor ourselves around that and grow an enterprise which can see those very fundamental aspects not only survive but flourish through innovation and creativity. And the folks in this room are, in my view, up to that task, or I wouldn't be here.
You've mentioned, and indeed the Chancellor in his address mentioned, the word community as well as being one of those core qualities. What do you see as Macquarie's role in the community and, for example, the participation in community engagement scheme? You know, is that an important model that reflects the Macquarie version?
Well, the notion of communitarianism is deeply rooted in my belief system about the future of society and the future of universities as important elements of sustainable society going forward. And with that communitarianism comes a belief system, and there are some fundamentals in that do involve caring about the people in our communities and caring about the environment in our community. And that, I think, translates directly into Macquarie University's position in this city, on this magnificent parcel of land, beside a technology park which is part of the adjacent community in the city of Ryde, in the Greater Sydney Basin in Australia. And so I think that the community engagement participation program that's been developed by Professor Sachs, my colleague as the provost, and her colleagues, is one of the extraordinary icons of achievement of this university, which we as a university should be celebrating far more widely than we are. And I certainly have endorsed the expansion of that program, where our students, and we believe that every single Macquarie University student should have the opportunity for meaningful community engagement as a part of their, not just their education, but their preparation under our stewardship or custodianship to become active, lifelong participants in the communities that they will serve ultimately. And service is a very important part of that program, and service is a very important part of my model of how a university should conceive of itself and how we as leaders should see our roles as leaders, the notion of a servant leader.
I want to talk to you about that idea of the development of the servant leader in perhaps the context of your family learning and your family education. Let's just go back a little bit to the family now, because you were actually the first person in your entire family ever to go to university. Where did that encouragement for you to do that come from?
Well, one of my aunts had a university degree, but I was the first one in my direct family to attend university. And it came out of an unconditional belief on the part of my parents that my brother and my life should be better than theirs. My father, a working class man who left school in the Depression years to support, he was the oldest child, to support his mother and younger siblings.
He worked in the railways all his life?
New South Wales Government Railroad his entire life. A wonderful man whose simple approach to life was about, he wanted my brother and I to have opportunities that he had not enjoyed as a boy and a young man in the Midwest and far west of the state. My mother, who came from a far west grazing family, a family of some means historically, but she married my father as a working class man. And so I learned from my father, I think, the sense of constancy of purpose. His goal was solitary. Benjamin Disraeli, I think, said it best in saying that the secret of success is the constancy of purpose. My father lived Benjamin Disraeli's words without knowing who Benjamin Disraeli was, or those words. My mother was an incredible person who lived a life, had no post-high school training, had aspired to be a nurse, but that was interfered with by the ravages of World War II when her younger brother did not return from a prison camp, and she had to pick up the pieces of her family's life in the far west of New South Wales and help her aging father run a 60,000 acre sheep station. So she could apparently ride a horse and handle stock whip. A vision of my mother I still can never not be softly spoken, kindly lady whom I knew as my mother.
But a very practical.
A very practical woman, and a woman who understood service. She devoted her entire life, which I remember as a young child, and particularly after we left home to pursue our various working lives, to the service to the community and others.
This concept of service, though, I want to come back to the idea of the servant leader. It seems a contradictory concept, and yet leading through serving is important to you, but how does it work?
Servant leadership, for me, springboards out of something that I didn't really understand, but that's the framework I worked until I learned about the theory of servant leadership from Robert Greenleaf, and I'll perhaps come back to him in a moment. But it does involve the sense that leaders of organisations have a stewardship and a custodianship responsibility. That our job is not to own in a sole way the power and authority. Our job is to listen and learn and respect our colleagues and to help shape the dialogue, to promote dialogue and discourse as opposed to debate. To me, debate is a wonderful part of Australian society. It belongs in the parliaments, where it provides extraordinary leadership, as well as great theatre occasionally. But the work of leading complex organisations is not about debate in the strict sense of the word, where there is an implied winner and an implied loser. To me, this is about shaping, in a way, the pathway forward, in a way which will respect the individuality of all views, but hopefully come to a consensus. I will strive to be a consensus builder, but I will push the envelope for creativity and innovation. And when the tough choices are required to be made, when consensus can't be reached or convergence can't occur, I will have no hesitation to make those tough choices.
So that's the concept of leadership and responsibility. But one of the responsibilities we all have is to find that work and life balance. And it's always a tough act one way or another. How good are you at that? How good are you at finding the personal work-life balance?
I think on average over professional realms, I'd maybe give myself in general a B+ or occasionally an A-. On the work-life balance, I think I probably fall a little short of those. I've learned about myself that I do need to pay regard to that. Before I actually started working here full-time, one of the very first things I did was join the university gym, because I was never a sportsman, as I've declared to you before, would be completely hopeless. So I played in some position in cricket that's way out over the batsman's right shoulder, but I can't remember what it's called. And I used to have to walk a long way to the other side of the field, the end of every over, I believe they're called.
That was the useful exercise.
And that was the extent of my performance in sport, but I have become a gym addict. I recognise that endorphins in the bloodstream are a particularly good thing, and rather than seeking to receive those by some illicit substance, I can adequately do those by having a wonderful Macquarie University gym trainer beat me around at least once a week, and if he acts out tonight, if he's here, you're fired.
Well, it's great to hear that fun and fitness is happening. And what would you give us a little secret here? What is your most relaxing recreational activity? What is the thing that just makes you go, oh, you know, is it a huge hot bath, or is it something else?
It is. I think I enjoy music. I listen to music a lot. In fact, as I gathered my thoughts after a rather busy 24 hours in the last one, probably the most busy since I've been here. You know, I have a couple of little speakers beside my computer, and I put on some Schubert Evensong with a wonderful Robert Shaw chorale, and I soothe myself with that to come down here. I think it's probably the combination of music and cooking. I actually like to cook.
Do you have a signature dish?
A signature dish to me is defined by if every pot and pan in the kitchen has not been made dirty, it's not worthwhile. So I actually enjoy particularly, I like to eat, and I particularly like dessert, and I like to cook dessert, so I have some dessert little numbers that some of you might enjoy over time. My great triumph this weekend was to prove that in my new kitchen I can actually produce a replica which is very reliable of a ginger cookie. That was this weekend.
Well, actually, what we haven't confessed is that everybody is invited over to your place for dinner afterwards. So it should be terrific. Look, I think on that note of imagining you in the kitchen cooking up a storm, we should say a very warm thank you for sharing so much, Professor Bruce Dowton. Thank you.